One of the areas that I've really nerded out on is I feel like sometimes these spiritual concepts can be just hard to access for tech people, certainly for intellectually superior atheists. Some of it sounds a little woo. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to translate. And I've found that there's some really, really useful tools to help understand the psychological development process that a person goes through.
Mm.
Buddhists did it through the stages of insight, but also Harvard did it through developmental constructivism. And they mapped out like the socially oriented self, the self-driving or self-creating self, and then the self-transcending self, right? And so they've sort of mapped it into these three stages as well. Spiral dynamics was also out of Harvard in a similar time frame. Integral theory, uses a different set of names and nomenclature for that linear sort of progression of human consciousness from when you're very, very small, everything is subject. There's no even such thing as a difference between me and mom, all the way up to non-duality, awakened people, where it's all non-dual. So I found that those tools can be super useful in terms of translating it into the tech world.
And we are live. Hello, everybody. My name is Wei Ting. I'm the host of Founder Meditations. Today, I'm so excited to welcome Ryan Vaughn with us today. Ryan, welcome.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here. Thanks, Wei Ting. It's nice to see you again.
Yeah, it's great to see you. So Ryan is a 3-time startup founder and CEO. After he sold his last startup, he became a executive coach at Inside Out Leadership. And I'm very excited to have Ryan with us today. So Ryan, can you please share a little bit more about maybe some quick life story for you as a startup founder and how you became a founder coach?
Yeah, I mean that's a long story. It's interesting because it's all interwoven with my spiritual journey, my consciousness journey as well, which I think is a lot of what your podcast is about. But we'll say that most of my life, I had a really clear idea of who I wanted to be. And, that started out as like, I wanted to be a professional basketball player. So I was like, look at all the pro basketball players and like, well, what do I got to do in order to be that? I got to practice every day. So I practiced so much. I got to get tatted up. So I got the tattoos and, all the different things around like, I'm going to live into this idea of a professional basketball player. And I was pretty good, but that went about as far as it could go. And at some point, the basketball dream ended. And then I was sort of, faced with the first of a few identity crises I've had in my life. And this was like, if I'm not a future pro basketball player, then, who am I? And that first one, I got really mad about it and sort of resentful about the fact that I couldn't be what I had, planned on being. Notwithstanding the fact that like 400 people in the world get to be that. So, it was a long shot to begin with, but in response to that, I ended up getting, really into drugs and alcohol and kind of went down a pretty dark path for 4 or 5 years. I just packed in, as much drinking and drugs into a 4 or 5 year, period of time that, way more than most people pack into their lives. And then that also sort of like ran its course. I ended up at sort of my nadir, the low point. I was in jail after my second DUI, and had to sort of reconcile this what life had become with all of the people that I wanted to be, the image that I had for myself. And eventually that I got out, I got sober, and started. I kind of like started looking around, and I was like, all right, well, what should I become? This is the land of opportunity. Be all you can be, right? What should I be? And at that time, this was early Facebook, early Twitter. So it was like 2007, maybe something like that. And you look around, and what I saw was a whole bunch of startup founders, and that seemed like the career choice, the life choice that would lead to the most fun, the most admiration. This would be the really cool thing, to do. I had no experience in it at the time. I was a writer prior to that. My whole education was in writing. But hey, I'm going to go be a startup founder. And so really sort of buttressed and catalyzed by the recent sobriety and all this excitement around like what I could create. Went off and started a few companies. The first two were failures, but like at larger and larger scales. So I learned stuff on the way up on both of them. And then the third one was a company called VNN, which was kind of like ESPN.com for high schools is how we thought about it. And that lasted 10 years, soup to nuts. And it grew from, myself to, by the time the company sold, I think it had like 300 and something people at it. So it grew pretty sizable. And in that whole journey, that sort of 15-year journey of being a CEO, I was having a blast at it and just really, really enjoying it for about 13 of those years. And right around like a couple years before I ended up leaving, it became clearer and clearer to me that the person that I was being in order to run this company, in order to scale and raise money and all that stuff, I had this idea of like, I should be, I have a really good sense of I should be this type of CEO for my investors, and I should be this type of leader for my employees, and this type of leader for, all these different stakeholder groups. And I was just trying my best to be that person in these live up to my role in these situations. And that just got exhausting at a certain point, and like holding all of that together, holding together all of the different ways I was supposed to support people and all the different people I was supposed to be just became too much. So I stepped away from the organization, hired my replacement. When I came back for a hot minute afterwards, I actually got in a fight with my replacement and he ended up firing me, which is a whole nother story. But for a minute there, and I think like as that process began, the big question that I had was, and as I began my sabbatical, is, well, if I'm not the CEO of this company and that doesn't feel right anymore, then who am I now? And I've worked with a lot of founders in sort of this post-exit, post-success phase. I do a lot of work with founders later stage like that. And oftentimes the knee-jerk reaction, as it was for me too, is like, well, I'm going to start the next company. Like, who am I? I'm the guy that, is going to, right now I'm not the guy who runs VNN, but I'm going to be the guy who starts this thing. Ba-boom, and, off you go. And that was so natural for me. And I actually started a company right afterwards, but that felt weird. So I ended up not doing anything with it. And the thing that I did different that time than I did in any other sort of the three previous, ego death experiences or thereabouts that I had, I'd always recreated myself those previous times, whether it's from, basketball to, the Jim Morrison type of a direction to CEO, founder, whatever. I always had this idea still of I was going to be somebody. And after leaving my company, I didn't recreate myself. I sort of, took the time, which was a lot of time. I was gone for about 18 months, but I took the time to get comfortable just being Ryan. Not Ryan, the guy who's building la 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 la, or Ryan, the guy who scaled la la la, or Ryan, the guy who raised this much money, or whatever, any of those things, those ways that I had buttressed my identity with my accomplishments, but just Ryan. And that was really uncomfortable at first. You get all these questions from people like, well, so what's next, man? What are you building next? That sort of thing. And that happens constantly. And I just, again, had to get comfortable with, I don't know. Right now I'm just kind of exploring. I really like these things. I'm spending time over here, and yeah, I'm just me, just here. And job one at that phase, this sort of interweaves into the whole spiritual journey, was become comfortable with that and let go of the ways that I had been making myself better or more important or more impressive with my career. Decouple those things. And then out of that, just sort of resting space, I got a sense, sort of a felt sense, that what I should do is I should go back to writing. And that was the first time I had written in 15 years, because I had been off making something of myself. So I went back to writing, didn't write about anything in particular, just kind of started writing and publishing. And that eventually led to writing around leadership and the startup journey, which led to clients that wanted to work with me. And before long, I'm coaching people. And that sort of, what historically had been very much a vision-led process around, this is my vision for who I want to be, and I'm going to go become that, shifted into much more of an emergent process, where it's like, I'm not going to try to be anything. I'm just going to be here and try to listen for what wants to come through me today. And it started as writing, it evolved into coaching, and then that evolved into building a coaching firm. And now I run a firm with 3 other coaches, 4 of us total. All of whom are exited founders that support founders going through the journey at various stages. And none of it with a real clear vision of like, it's going to be this, and here's, I'm going to paint by numbers to make it, but all very much like, just try to do good work today, and let the outcomes and the direction all sort of take care of itself. So that's been a really profound shift, and a really, it's much more fun in my experience building from that place.
Yeah. And now as a founder coach, how do you work with founders?
It's the entire journey, right? The startup journey. In my experience and working with the other coaches that we work with, we each sort of have experience, from founding a company, funding it or raising money, scaling it and selling it. Like, we've all gone through that process. In some cases, multiple times. There's a couple of our coaches that have had, 4 or 5 exits. But each person has their own interests, we'll say, or like passions in terms of what stage of the startup process they find the most rewarding. And for me, that has a lot to do with the parts of the journey that were the most impactful to me, the ones that were the hardest, the ones that I fucked up the most. I don't know if you can curse on here, but the ones that I screwed up the most. And learn something from. And so I have an appreciation for how challenging those areas are. And that's sort of the work that I end up doing. So I end up working, for that reason, a lot with early stage founders who are just in the, sort of product market fit has been achieved, but now we're in the process of scaling. We're trying to build the systems and build the human organization to support the scaling structure, which I completely, boofed in a bunch of different ways on the first time I tried to do that, and had to learn a lot. So I have a sense of that, and I help founders throughout that process. And then also what I sort of referred to earlier as post-success founders. So it's founders that have had an exit and are now faced with, not the puppies and sunshine and trumpets that they expected an exit to be, but instead like the disorientation and sort of vacuum where their purpose used to be, and identity crisis and everything else that goes along with it. And I sort of help founders to reorient from creating businesses because it serves sort of an external, market need, to creating businesses because there's a gift inside you that you want to give to the world. And that sort of fundamental sort of restructuring of the creative process is some of what I do too. So it's, and those are like maybe focal areas, but ultimately people end up, they bring in what they bring in. And sometimes it's directly to do with those parts of the founder's journey and other parts of the founder's journey. And some parts it has to just do with the human journey of building a company, families and kids and everything else. So I found that when I was a CEO and I was working with a coach, I worked with 3 of them, and I always had to choose. There's either like the been there, done that guy, or there was the psychologist. And either been there, done that guy could help me in terms of the actual how-to of doing things, and then the psychologist could help me understand how my mind worked and how to best leverage that. And it was super hard to find somebody who could do both. And so each of the coaches at Inside Out are the reason that we've sort of collected together, is because we all endeavor to do both of those things. We all have the startup experience, but then are also certified in various types of executive coaching. And then I also have a degree in psychology. So Soup to nuts, man.
That's incredible. I think now is a good segue to start talking about your spiritual practice and journeys. I actually noticed that the way you describe how your
Sure.
life has unfolded, you use the term ego death to describe how you, I
Hmm.
guess, went through different identities. The term ego death is actually a pretty common term in the spiritual slash psychedelics world. So maybe you can share a little bit more about your spiritual journey
Sure.
and practice and how it unfolded for you.
Man, again, like big topic, right? So what's coming to me now, and this might be an interesting way of sort of entering into it, but like I have experience in psychedelics. I have a lot of experience in all sorts of different meditative practices and other tools. I tend to be sort of a uh, really excited about stuff and about learning stuff. And when I get into something, I tend to like dive in both feet and just like immerse myself in the process. So spirituality was similar, and so I've experimented all over the place, right? But there's definitely a thread too, and I think one way of sort of parsing that is I grew up in a not particularly religious household, but my parents took me to church, various like two or three different types of churches. They took me to a synagogue. They took me to a mosque. They just kind of like showed me around all the different things in the neighborhood that I grew up in, and they're like different ways of looking at faith or at God or at what have you. So just expose you to all these different things, and you can decide what feels good to you. And that I really appreciated that method of introducing God into a kid's consciousness. Um, and for me, initially I grew up in Michigan in I think that we're called the Rust Belt, but we're also in this town we're very Bible-y too. And so there's a lot of church and a lot of Jesus in the water, where I grew up. And so I started, first sort of getting into that, and in a really sort of young, immature way, very doctrinal, very like getting into the right way of how all this stuff needs to happen, and so forth. And as I've seen happen, there's some friends of mine as well who were much more exposed to that than I was. But eventually, I sort of became disillusioned by that process, and this was probably around the time when my basketball days ended, and I sort of got into general disillusionment with life too. Um, and at that time, I became what now I think of as like an intellectually superior atheist, which is you sort of get a sense of what that might come with. And I lived in there for like 20 odd years until uh, I started meditating regularly when I was running my company, but it was really sort of a like, how do I get calm because I'm so friggin' stressed all the time. So how do I help myself to just manage this? Um, and it didn't kick into a higher gear until I left my company and had that space to really dive into the identity question. Um, and I think that identity question has been the driving force behind my own spiritual journey. I explored it from sort of Eastern traditions perspectives. Advaita Vedanta made a lot of sense to me. Taoism, Buddhism, some of these other traditions. And particularly because like Ramana Maharshi's question around like who am I, and there's I think a number of spiritual leaders who use that as the crux of a self inquiry process that can lead you back into source. Um, and and I think my experience. I started to I got my first taste of that through meditation, through first taste of like non-dualism through meditation, reinforced that through psychedelics, started studying really deeply in some of the Eastern stuff, and like kind of again I jump in with both feet and really really went there. But then interestingly, like I found that my experience as a white guy from America is getting into the Buddhism, Taoism, some of the Eastern traditions. It really appeals to the logical part of me way more than some of the stories, and the metaphors do in some of the Western traditions. But it doesn't feel I feel a little bit like an outsider entering into that because I didn't grow up in that sort of that sort of tradition, right? And so these days, while I continue to, sort of my meditative practice is built around shikantaza, which is like a zazen meditation, and a lot of it's around choiceless awareness and this question of who am I, and trying to anchor my seat of awareness in non-dualism as opposed to dualism or witness consciousness. But in the meantime, I find myself also now pulled back into it. Really surprise plot twist. I find myself pulled back towards Christianity, which is never what I expected to happen. But looking back at it from the perspective that I've built through some of the Eastern tools and scaffolding, I find that it makes a hell of a lot more sense than it ever did. And as another way of another finger pointing at the moon, right? And because that is so ever present where I am in the world, and sort of has been, the background for my whole childhood. Yeah, I find myself spending a lot of time recently, sort of just immersing myself in that, and allowing that to be another path among many that I use to for my own journey.
Yeah.
I'm imagining that's one particular type of the journey, but you're a founder too. I'm curious how does your spiritual journey intertwine with your foundership, as it were?
Yeah, happy to share. My story is somewhat of a stereotypical journey. I guess a lot of people go through the door of
There's no such thing.
spirituality because of suffering, right? And people say like 90% of people who go through the door of suffering. So that was my situation as well. Like me, life as a founder is very stressful, and that could make an impact on your personal lives as well. So I started meditating
Yeah.
not as a way to relieve my suffering, but as a way to become smarter. Like Tim Ferriss, all the other smart founders talk about how wonderful it's like going to a gym to become fit, and you become smarter by meditation, right? So that sounds very appealing. So I remember about
Mm.
3 years ago, like Ray Dalio openly talked about, getting someone to meditate will be the biggest gift that he can give to anyone. Yeah, and I listened and I started to
Mm.
consciously try to meditate as a habit, right? Because all the smartphone, I want to be like them, and that's what I did. And that's in a way, it's kind of like a spade and switch. So I got in because I want to become smarter. I see this as a tool for me to make me become a better founder. So the first year of meditation is not spiritual at all. But then within
Yeah.
weeks, it worked on me. I became much calmer. I became noticeably happier. And I remember I started to essentially become one of the biggest advocates of meditation among my peers. I started to talk about, hey, you should uh, start meditation
Yeah.
because that became so
You
much
really are too.
happier.
I remember when we first met, you were really like that was almost what you led with. You're like just grinning ear to ear, and you're like, yeah. By the way, we met in a CEO forum that you were a part of with a number of other CEOs. I remember you coming in talking about meditation on day one, and
Yeah.
I'm just cracking up on how cool this is. So yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And that was relatively early on in my journey at that time. But it's actually roughly around that time where I guess my practice has become more spiritual. I guess as things start to unfold, I guess I started to read a few books. I remember the first book. I think I
oh
remember
yeah,
show it to you. It's Awareness by Anthony DeMello. That one was somewhat popular
uh
in the
huh,
tech circle. So I think that was like the first spiritual book that I have ever read in my life,
hmm,
and that instantaneously made an impact on me. And then after that, because I'm also a modern left-brained startup founder who's somewhat analytical, so I then start reading like Sam Harris's "Waking Up" book, the book,
that's a
which
good
is
one,
like
huh?
yeah, it's a It's a secular take
Yeah.
on spirituality without any religion flavor
Yeah.
whatsoever.
When I read Waking Up the first time, I was in that sort of maybe on the tail end of that intellectually superior atheist phase, and I read this book and I was like, hell yeah, this is exactly what makes sense. I remember that, but it was also a really interesting on ramp from atheism into spirituality, minus all the religion stuff. I thought it was really, really well done from that perspective.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You talk about intellectual spirituality. I remember hearing Sam Harris. I think he was either calling himself or the book that it's like he's like Eckhart Tolle for smart people. Yeah, which is probably true, but I found it
For
fascinating.
intellectuals.
Yes, I
Yeah,
found it
yeah, yeah.
fascinating for him to say that openly.
Yeah, yeah, that's there are these books that have had, I mean, Waking Up I feel like is probably pretty foundational in like sort of the intersection between spirituality and tech.
Mm.
I wonder, awareness, I think, also, but I'm thinking also of there's a guy named Jed McKenna. Have you ever read any of his stuff?
Yeah, he's about psychedelics and mushrooms. Is that?
Uh, I'm thinking of, what is that? I think it's Jed McKenna, and I know exactly who you're talking about, but that's not him. But this guy, it's a pen name for another guy, another realized being, and he writes under this pen name, and it's just very sort of matter of fact, like direct around how that process is. And I remember hearing a lot about him when I first sort of crossed those two lines and started to talk with other folks in the tech world. But there are definitely these sort
Yeah,
of
impressive. Yeah.
texts that I think have an overstated influence on how tech people view spirituality, just because they've sort of done the rounds within that community.
Yeah. You talked about shikantaza as your main practice, and also you talk about non-duality or
Mm-hmm.
non-dualism. Can you, maybe for people who are listening who might not be that familiar with those terms, can you just like briefly describe what you meant by those?
With Shikantaza?
Yes. And also non-duality or non-dualism.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Non-duality refuses explanation, but by its nature. But um, so non-duality, the one of the, I think, core learnings, or one of the foundational learnings in most spiritual practices is that there, as you start to ask the question, "Who am I?" is maybe one way of doing this, or through meditation is another way of doing this. You start to gain a better understanding, a better insight, some insights into um, who you are, if not your body, who you are, if not your mind, who you are, if not, you start to peel away these little pieces of yourself. And over time, you realize that there is there's a looker who's looking, right? If I'm looking at my hand, I can't be my hand because I'm looking at it. So the question is, well, what is it that's looking then? There's this guy named Douglas Harding who does, he wrote a book called On Having No Head. And he has this really cool practice where he's like, look out, look at your hand, and then point back at yourself like this. And what is the finger pointing at? And you sort of get a sense, this self-referential nature of consciousness, you start to get a sense for. Um, and part of the process, or part of how I've sort of for myself marked the progress on my spiritual journey, is how much of myself, quote unquote, am I currently identified with? Am I identifying with my mind, like it is me and there's no separation between? Or can I move some of my mind, my thoughts, from subject to object so I can look at them? Can I watch my thoughts? And by moving them from subject to object, gain a little bit of distance between myself and them, which opens up a whole bunch of philosophical questions, but also some new tools around how do I work with mind, right? Same thing with body. Same thing with ultimately self. The whole concept of self. One of the core tenets of Buddhism is this idea of non-self. And you meditate enough, or you ask, "Who am I?" enough, you start to see through the idea that there is a self. You can start to do that by just asking yourself a question. Okay, If there's a self, cool, where is it? And then you just kind of look, and what you find over time is that there's no place where a self exists. It doesn't actually exist. Um, and scientists have sort of mapped, according to electrical signatures in your brain, when you're thinking about yourself, there's this part of your brain called the default mode network that helps to create this idea of a self as a means of like preserving the body, presumably, from an adaptive perspective. If you have a self, then you don't want to jump off a bridge, sort of a thing, right? But ultimately, it's totally made up. There's no such thing as a self. And as you move the body from subject to object, it becomes part of the entire landscape, along with that chair, along with that window, everything else. As you move the mind, same thing. It's a thing that I look at. It's not me. And as you ultimately move the self, and you realize that even all of that is all object, it's just what's out there. Eventually, there stops being the duality between subject and object. Once all of subject is recognized as object, there's only one thing. And that one thing is what I think they refer to as non-duality. It's the lack of duality between subject and object. And one of the areas that I've really nerded out on is I feel like sometimes these spiritual concepts can be just hard to access for tech people, certainly for intellectually superior atheists. Some of it sounds a little woo. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to translate. And I've found that there are some really, really useful tools to help understand the psychological development process that a person goes through, from identifying with the groups I'm a part of and the roles that I play, all the way up to non-duality. Buddhists did it through the stages of insight, but also Harvard did it through developmental constructivism. And they mapped out like the socially oriented self, the self-driving or self-creating self, and then the self-transcending self, right? And so they've sort of mapped it into these three stages as well. Spiral dynamics was also out of Harvard in a similar time frame. Integral theory, uses a different set of names and nomenclature for that linear sort of progression of human consciousness from when you're very, very small, everything is subject. There's no even such thing as a difference between me and mom, all the way up to non-duality, awakened people, where it's all non-dual. So I found that those tools can be super useful in terms of translating it into the tech world. And when I'm working with clients and they find themselves directly looking at the spiritual process, then sometimes those are the tools that we use. And then shikantaza is a particular meditative form that is, objectless, meaning there's nothing to focus on. It's really just like, sit down, hold everything still, and watch what moves. That's how my teacher taught it to me. And then, there's more details to it, but I've found that it to be the most useful for me method to access that type of consciousness and to actually do the work of solidifying, whether it's non-dual consciousness or witness consciousness, into your daily life, so that it's not just I'm on the cushion and I'm meditating and I have an experience while I'm meditating, but also that meditative experience extends throughout the rest of life and changes the way that you interact with your life in the world. So I've spent, 15 years on it at this point, pretty much daily. I did some like 4.5 hour crazy sits where my legs about fell off. And then a whole bunch of small ones, and I've really enjoyed it.
Do you also do shikantaza on a moment by moment basis off the cushion, even like right now?
Yeah. That's it. That's what I mean in terms of the integration. Is it's the experience of it is, I think, a word that might gets close to the experience of it is it's like an experience of surrendering everything, surrendering your plans, surrendering like. I enter on this podcast, and there's a part of me that's like, oh, I better prep. I better make sure that this is like locked in, and I say the things I want to say, and what result do I want to produce? Blah 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 blah. Mind can do a bunch of interesting things like that, and if you think about practicing shikantaza, it's the actual act of it is recognizing, oh, look at all that stuff that mind is doing. Isn't that interesting? Nothing for me to do. It doesn't have much to do with me. It's just mind doing mind stuff. And with that recognition that this is, again, subject object, and then maybe with the question of like, well, who is this I that wants to do so well on a podcast anyway? You start to develop that distance, and you start to I mean, for me, your whole nervous system relaxes, and you end up showing up to the moment very differently.
Incredible. So I'm just curious, with all these insights and experiences that you had, how do you work with founders or executives as clients? Do you also try to get them to meditate? How does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, the meeting one, we're like, do you have a meditative practice? Sometimes I have to sell it, and when I have to sell it, I'm selling it on like, it'll help us with our work. It'll help you to gain some context over the thoughts that you have and how they're driving your behaviors. And your behaviors are the thing that are creating idiosyncrasies or log jams within your company. And so this is like the process that we're going to use. Sometimes I have to sell it. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes they already have that sort of a practice. But so much of high level leadership work starts from the realization that your company is a reflection of your consciousness. And just to say that a different way, the way that your company operates, the way that the people inside your company operate, the types of relationships that they have with each other, the productivity that they have, or the reactivity or politics or whatever the company looks like is a reflection of the leader's consciousness in some really real ways. And that's often hard to see at first until you start paying attention to how your consciousness is showing up in the world, how you're showing up in relationships with people. The way that like, this meeting is not that important, so I'll be 5 minutes late, whatever, actually communicates something really important to your team, and among other things, tells them that like, well, I might just be 5 minutes to this thing. If that person's less important than me, then, so who cares? And that sort of thing can spread, pretty significantly. And as you're trying to make changes at a systems level, at an organizational level, recognizing that the cause of all of those symptoms is your behavior, and the cause of your behavior is your mental patterns and your emotional patterns, and the sort of cause and effect Rube Goldberg machine that is most consciousness. Meditation is the unlock, or the the microscope that allows us to look at actually what's going on under the hood, so we can be conscious of, here's how I'm creating this result. Here's how I'm making my team have a bunch of politics. Because I have a tendency of, when somebody says something, doesn't get their job done, I just sort of like do it for them. And then I'm like, just resent them for it, but I don't say anything. Now, all of a sudden I have all these politics in my organization, and the fix to that, or the way that you address it, is by, in the moment of somebody saying something, or somebody not getting their job done, acting differently. And instead, in this case, maybe holding them to account, or having a conversation around like, this won't work. And now all of a sudden we as an organization have a problem. How are we going to solve that? Which brings up, for most people, all sorts of different, most people want to be nice. Most people want to be liked. Most people have sort of a conflict avoidance default. But that's an interesting example around how conflict can actually create a safer environment for your organization, and avoiding conflict in that way, or just like, shoving it down, can lead to a very political organization. And meditation becomes the tool and the framework where we can explore all of these things and start to be more conscious about them, or at least it becomes one of the tools.
I'm curious, for the founders that you work with, what do the landscape look like? Do most of them have a interest in meditation? Have you ever worked with anyone who have absolutely no interest, who are very mind identified? You have to like convince them and basically meet them where they're at?
For sure. Yeah. I don't know this for sure. I have a sense from, working with the other coaches at our firm, and then just, kind of knowing other coaches, that I probably, bias a little bit toward mindful leaders. Maybe not even a little bit, maybe a lot of it, just because of, who I am, and the fact that I'm pretty, public about my spiritual journey, and how that interplays with leadership. So, according to the lenses that I'm using. And so in my case, it's pretty common, certainly more common than not, that somebody has, in addition to a desire to grow and scale an organization and have an impact in the world through their startup or through their organization, they also have a identified interest in deepening their connection with themselves in understanding what life is about and how they can grow an organization, grow a great organization in the context of a great life, as opposed to just great organization and then all the other stuff is I'm willing to sacrifice it at the altar of being successful, right? Um, Sometimes I'll still run into that founder who's like, fuck it, I don't care. I just need this to work, and I'm willing to do anything else, sacrifice anything else to make this thing happen. And then there's a lot of Miyagiing, sort of you got to meet somebody where they're at and help them to kind of discover on their own the way that their beingness impacts the results that they get in their organization. And what happened for me is that, I started very much in the space of I'm just going to make this thing successful and I don't care about anything else. But over time, you realize how big of an impact your consciousness has on your organization. And that becomes kind of the on-ramp toward self-inquiry, towards the self-inquiry process and understanding why you are the way that you are, why your mind works the way that it works, and allowing yourself to bring conscious choice to it. And then as it happens for you, and I think happens to a lot of people, once you have a taste of that, once you start to see, you've gotten a little bit of that positive feedback to see how malleable all this is and how valuable it can be to develop some of that subject-object distance, then it takes on a life of its own, and you just start to, in many cases, like propel yourself forward in that direction.
Are there any practical resources that you find yourself recommending to founders? For example, any books, practices, YouTube channels, anything that might be interesting for founders to look into?
Mm-hmm. Honestly, there's not this stuff isn't one size fits all. It's all, it depends on the person. And so I'll have different recommendations for different people ultimately. But I guess I have my go-tos, or like the things that I have found super useful that for people that resonate with me, they might sort of bat a higher percentage with these things. But the ones that I think I suggest the most is the Waking Up app for meditation. When I was transitioning from venture-backed startup founder world, entering into whatever's next, this emergent world, one of the first things that I did is I started teaching meditation to business leaders all across the world. And I did that for a year or so. And I found that one of the core problems when you're trying to implement a meditation practice is just doing it. For, at the early stage, it's habit formation. Before any of the positive, feedback loops and insights and concentration benefits that you get. Initially, it's like, I got to build this habit. And that apps in general do a great job of helping people to build a meditation habit. That app in particular, I think, does a wonderful job of not stripping away the depth of meditation. Some of the other apps are just sort of so secular, so, get calm, get smart, get whatever, that they lose some of the opportunity to inquire into who you really are and what's really going on in life. They lose some of the opportunity for insight. And I think Sam Harris has done a great job of making it accessible to the Western intellectual smart people mind, as he says it, his words, not mine. And then also maintaining the depth that's possible through meditation. So that's one that I find myself recommending all the time as a tool for people who find themselves interested for any number of reasons.
Yeah. I mean, the Waking Up app is great. I also use it myself. I also became like a lifelong subscriber. So I bought like the lifetime access as a gift to my brother like a few years ago.
Yeah.
And there's actually a lot of well-known tech founders who are happy users. For example, Jason Fried from 37 Signals /Basecamp. I think he's also a heavy user of Waking Up. So it's nice to see all these intellectually superior founders find Waking Up to be helpful.
So I say intellectually superior to make fun of myself back in the day. Yeah. I'm certainly way less that than I once was, but I empathize with the idea, sort of the listening of the tech world is often so keyed toward optimization and toward the left brain. Maybe it's this way. So keyed towards the left brain that it's, you have to know who you're talking to and you have to be able to translate in that way. The other resource that I've personally found transformative was there's a guy named Michael Singer.
Yes.
You ever heard of Michael Singer?
Yes. In fact, I'm reading his book.
So he wrote
this week actually.
Which one?
The Untethered Soul.
Which one?
The Untethered. Yeah.
So Untethered Soul is the one that he's the most famous for. I don't know if you've read, he has another one. It's his autobiography called The Surrender Experiment. And the surrender experiment, in my mind or in my experience, um, that one changed my life. Really, really brilliant book. It's his autobiography. He details how he went from a yogi in the woods, and then through this process of surrendering. The process he went through is just whatever is going on in my life, I'm going to let go of what I want, let go of my plans, my hopes, my dreams, my likes, my dislikes, my fears, like just let go of all that stuff. And just in this moment, look at what is life asking of me, and how do I, what do I want to do? Like, how do I do that as faithfully as I can? And then just see what happens. And what ended up happening was he went from a yogi in the woods to running two public companies, getting invested by the FBI, like this crazy, wacky story. Uh, and it's again, like I think hits this intersection between, tech, this world of like, oh, public companies, da da da, that's impressive, and the method of surrendering and how powerful that can be. So for somebody that's interested in that part of the journey, I think that's a tremendous book too, and a great starting point.
Yeah, thank you. Let's switch gear a little bit and maybe let's talk about authenticity. Why do you see
Sure.
authenticity as something that's very important? Um, and can you talk more about it?
Why do I think authenticity is important? I mean, I find that like immediately upon hearing that question, I have a visceral, well, of course it is, sort of a thing, and it's almost like there's like a moral bent to it, like you should be authentic. But if we just let that go, because I'm not sure I buy that. In my experience in leadership, I was pretty inauthentic for a long time. I had a sense of who I ought to be for this person, and then I went around and tried my best to be that person. And that I think did for me lead to a whole bunch of suboptimal results. One of the core ways that I think this can kind of backfire is there's a lot of pressure and a lot of systems of supporting people in telling investors what they want to hear. If you're raising money, there's a way of raising money. There's pattern matching that investors do, and you could tell yourself a story that it really benefits you to speak in this type of a way and dress in this type of way and be this type of a person in order to raise money, because that's what those people look like, right? Or that's what they appear like. And that's why I wore like button-up shirts and didn't have a beard or anything like that while I was in the CEO seat. It was some weird idea that was going to be useful. But ultimately, when you set the stage, this is one example, when you set the stage for a relationship with an expectation that's not true, with an expectation that you said is not you, it's like I'm speaking this big game around this is what the startup's going to be and stuff like that, then you create a foundation that's just generally fragile for that relationship. And no matter what the inauthenticity is, that creates this fragileness of in this relationship, whether I said something in the fundraising process that was like mostly true, but kind of maybe a little bit fuzzy, or anything else under the sun. Now in that relationship, I have to protect it. I can't talk openly with you. I have to pay attention to, now I have to make sure that I'm protecting this other thing that I said that one time. Or I have to make sure that he feels this particular way about me because he needs to think that I'm competent. So many founders running around trying to make everybody think that they're good at their job, spending more time or as much time managing everybody's perceptions as they are actually doing a good job. So a lot of the time, and myself included, when I was scaling my company, ultimately I'm running around with a whole bunch of relationships that have sensitive spots. They have these areas where I have to pay attention to all sorts of different areas that I need to protect and shepherd in order to talk to these people and help us to organize and achieve the goals that we want to achieve. And that takes a hell of a lot of bandwidth, managing all those aspects of those relationships. Oftentimes, there's a lot of work associated with dealing with all of those things that you've created for yourself, all that relational cruft. Sometimes that can be pretty painful work. But on exiting my company, I had the opportunity to just wipe the slates clean and just kind of be real raw and honest with everybody about stuff. When I was fired from my company, the CEO that fired me he's like, as a matter of course, he's like, how do you want us to tell this story? You've been here for a long time. We could say that you just wanted to leave. We could say that, you're moving on to da 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 da. He's like, and for him, it was a courtesy. It's like, how do you want the world to see what happened in this case, right? And I had an opportunity at that point to tell the best story and have that be like what everybody thought, right? And I'm so insanely grateful looking back that I didn't. And at the time, I was like, no, I want to be honest. Call it what it is. We don't get along. You're firing me. That's what that is. Initially, I was pretty scared. Initially, like, what are people going to, how's that going to impact my career? How's it, la la la, all the stuff that I can tell myself. But ultimately, what it ended up doing is freeing up a whole bunch of my mind space, and in terms of like, I don't have to think about that anymore, and now I can have open and honest conversations with people about myself and about like how things happen. But it also like dropping to that level of vulnerability, particularly sharing something that is vulnerable, has been the cause of a lot of really great relationships that I've formed over the years since. Just talking about my history with drugs, talking about getting fired, talking about marriage stuff, or any of these types of topics that ordinarily people, or at least I, for a long time approached trying to manage people's perception of myself and having the right answer by being authentic. Authenticity has been the cause of a lot of the closest friends that I have in my life, many of whom have entered into my life. They were business acquaintances that we just talked about business, but then when I sort of allowed myself to be real, all of a sudden we've deepened our relationship pretty significantly. Yeah. I think authenticity is a topic you could go on for hours, but that's maybe an entry point.
Yeah, this is awesome. I found myself, my personal observation is that the ability to be authentic and vulnerable is directly, how do I say this, negatively correlated to how strong of an ego that you still have. From my observation is that people who seems to still be mind identified and have a pretty ego, they care about what others people think of them more. And hence, because of that, they are still clinging onto this false image of themselves that they are afraid of showing any weaknesses to the world. Is that also something that you observe from the clients that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, I think from one perspective, for sure, I think there's probably some correlation there, but I think it's equally possible to have a really strong ego around being vulnerable. And I could become the vulnerable guy, and I could show up, giving me all this stuff and going into this, but then really that's what I'm creating for myself. I'm creating this persona and this ego identity of the vulnerable guy. That's what Chogyam Trungpa used to talk about as spiritual materialism. It's this idea that anything, including the spiritual journey and spiritual tools, can be used either to deconstruct the ego on the spiritual journey or to support and buttress the ego just as easily. So I think as you're on this journey, it's pretty important to be intentional and aware of your motivations and be honest with yourself, because that's a tricky bastard sometimes.
For any other founders who may not have the chance to work with you yet, is there any small practices or tools or any visualization techniques that you can recommend founders to try at their leisure time to be happier and more productive?
Look at the parts of you that want to be more productive and understand where those comes from would be the first place that I would start. And that's meant partially in jest, but also seriously. I've put together a series of resources that exist on our website, which is leadinsideout.io, that are various tools and techniques that are useful for this, from an examination of IFS, internal family systems, to neuro-linguistic programming, to various types of meditation. So there are a lot of resources that we've compiled that can be useful. But if I were, as a general starting point for people who have some amount of experience with meditation but are looking to deepen their practice and deepen their spiritual journey, I think that's a great place to start with Shikantaza. And the instructions for that are really simple. There's a Shikantaza, a Zen master studied in the Suzuki and Trungpa lineages, that lives like a half hour from my house. So I just happened to be right next to this guy. And I studied with him for a while. His name's Sokuzan. He's a really cool dude. And his instructions for Shikantaza were really simple. So I can even tell you to you right now. It's sit down. The ideal form is cross-legged, a couple feet from a blank wall and stare at the wall. You keep your eyes open, which helps with the translation from cushion to life, because you live your life with your eyes open, right? You have your eyes open, staring at the wall, and you hold everything still. All the parts. You hold your body still. You hold your mind still. You hold everything that you can hold still, and then just pay attention to what moves. And what you learn is immediately how little things we have control over, how little we can actually hold still, how much of it's out of our control and is just kind of running in the background. Your heart beating, your eyes twitching, your breathing, your mind going, all these different types of things. And as you're holding all these things still, there's nothing to fix or change about the fact that your mind's moving. It's just the noticing that this is all happening that is the practice itself. And so sit down, hold everything still, watch what moves. And you'll notice the things that are moving. And then what you'll further notice is the way that you react to those things, which is an automatic pattern as well that you don't have control over. And you'll react to them in one of three ways, predominantly. The first way is you will be attracted to it. You'll want more of it. So you have like a good feeling in your chest or something like that. Like, hell yeah, this is great. Or a good one is like, ooh, this meditation's going really well. And you'll be like, yeah, like, you get that sense of, yeah, I really want to go towards this. So that's one reaction is sort of this craving reaction. The other reaction is aversion, which is, oh, this meditation sucks. It's going the wrong way. Like, I got to do something different. What's wrong here? Or I have a thought that I don't like, and so I'll push away. That's number two, is aversion. Or the third one is I will look away and I'll distract myself. And there's a thing that strikes me in a way that I don't want, and so I'll think about something else. And you start to see the patterns between not only like all the things that you can't control, but then how those things that you can't control, like a thought, kicks off either a craving or an aversion or looking away, and how that starts to spin the entire machine. And so the opportunity with shikantaza is by sitting down, holding everything still and watching what moves, you get to really a real felt sense of what it means to be human, and that insight, what it means to be you even, and that insight can be worth an awful lot. And I think there's lots of mileage in that practice for people.
Thank you so much for this mini guided meditation on shikantaza. This is incredible. I'm sure people will find it helpful. I know we're wrapping up now. So as a final question, do you have any advice to give to other founders who might be curious about meditation but have not started yet? Or maybe the founders who are so busy that they struggle to find time to meditate?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a couple of things. So for the first group of people who are questioning it and don't have any experience with it, my first Buddhist teacher told me, this was the same guy, Sokuzan, he told me, don't trust anything that anybody tells you, including me. Don't trust anything that I tell you either. Just look for yourself and trust yourself. I think that's probably the best initial meditation instructions. That's, I think, really good advice for meditation. Just, try it. Don't go in with the expectation that it's going to do X, Y, Z, da, 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 da. Don't, follow somebody else's advice because you think it's going to, be the next second coming of whatever. But try it and see what it is for you. And I think that's the right attitude to go into it with. And if you're very busy, we talked about earlier how maybe early stages, it's just about habit building. So from a really practical perspective, do the thing that makes you do it. And don't worry about like form or format or length or app or no app or any of that shit. That can all come later. The most important part early on is just getting the car moving. And so whatever it means, whatever is required to meditate for 2 minutes a day, do that. And then make it 5. And then introduce an app. And then make it 7. And then try this other thing, whatever. But the important part is every day, just touch it. And I think that's a great way to get started. There's this story that might be a good ending point for those folks who are trying to justify the time expense for meditation. If you're running a company, it's a real question you have to ask yourself is, what's the most valuable use of my time? this reporter asked the Dalai Lama at one point. He's like, Mr. Dalai Lama, you run a country, you run a religion, you're writing, all these books, you're on this circuit of interviews, you're busy as hell. Probably didn't say that. He probably said, you're really busy. And I hear that you meditate for 5 hours a day. How in the world do you meditate for 5 hours a day with all the stuff that you're doing? And the Dalai Lama was like, oh, that's a really good point. It's a really interesting insight. I do a lot. With all that stuff that I'm doing, I should probably meditate 6 hours a day. And that's just it's words that come from a place that's coming from a fundamentally different place than the question was asked. And I think that can be an interesting frame to try on as you embark on this journey.
Ryan, thank you so much. I really enjoy our conversation. Where can people find you?
Yeah, me too.
Online?
Yeah, I write a lot. So a great way to stay in touch and is to you can subscribe to our newsletter. It's at leadinsideout.io. The newsletter itself is linked there, or you can go to leadinsideout.substack.com, and that's where the newsletter is hosted. And I would absolutely love anybody that's listening to this. I would absolutely love, one of my favorite things of writing has been the people that I get to meet and the conversations that I get to have, and as a response to some of the topics that we explore. So as we write about this intersection between spirituality and business at those web addresses, if that sparks something with any of your listeners and they want to reach out and deepen that conversation, I would absolutely welcome it. That's one of my huge joys.
Yeah.
Is getting a chance to connect with readers, and in this case with listeners. So
awesome. Ryan, thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your journey. This is great. Thank you.
Real pleasure. Thank you for having me on here. Bye, Wei Ting.